We're starting off this year's draft rankings with the big boys. It's defensive tackle day here on the channel. I went through, I think it was 28 or 29 DTs in this class, came out with, I think it was 20 draftable grades when all was said and done, broken out between tier 1 through tier 5. Tier 1 obviously being the highest, tier 5 being, day 3 rotational guys. Some have upside that I think could push them higher throughout their career, but, they're most likely going to be day 3 picks. So, lots and lots and lots of guys to talk about today. It's going to be a very meaty episode. And as you might have noticed, we are not in the office today because I am still in the middle of moving, and this is still a complete shit show over here. My office is not fit for shooting. So we're doing this in the kitchen today. And to be honest, that's probably a good thing because we're sponsored by ButcherBox today anyway, so we're literally going to be using that stove in a little bit to make some really ridiculous stuff, but, more on them later. For now, we know why you're here, and that's to talk about all the defensive tackles in this class from number 1 through number 20-ish, whatever we ended up getting to on draftable grades. And as you might have expected, we only have one actual tier 1 player in this class. He's been the tier 1 player in this class since last year's draft class. He really needs no introduction. So why don't we start off here by breaking down the best DT in this class, Jalen Carter. Simply put, when just talking about pure on-field grade, Jalen Carter is one of the best interior defensive line prospects that I have ever seen. And I've been doing this for over 10 years now at this point. The last DT that I had this high of a grade on was Quinnen Williams, who obviously turned out to be an absolute monster once he kind of sorted out his health or durability issues from his first couple years. Once he had a healthy season, he ended up being an all-pro caliber DT, kind of like we expected. And Quinnen was the highest grade that I'd given to any DT since Aaron Donald in 2014, who I thought was one of the 3 best players in that draft class, and I mocked him within the top 5, if I recall correctly, to the Raiders that year. So that's the kind of company we're talking about here is Quinnen Williams, Aaron Donald, and Jalen Carter. In terms of ideal role, he's one of the only truly scheme-proof players in this class. Whether you're an odd front team or, you're like a traditional 4-3, it kind of doesn't matter. He could play 3 technique. He could play 5 technique. I've seen him play nose and 2-eye and be just fine at it. He is just unbelievable in terms of pure talent. He has the power to hold up against double teams. He's exceptionally quick. He's got every pass rush move you can think of. He just has every single tool, just like Quinnen Williams did when he was coming out of Bama. Again, another guy who could play, either a shade nose or a 2-eye or a 3 technique, 5 technique. I really think it doesn't matter what your defense is. Jalen Carter fits it. Just to hammer home, again, how ridiculously good this kid is. If you go back to the 2021 Georgia defense where, pretty much all of them are going to be in the NFL. Jordan Davis was on that team. The first overall pick, Trayvon Walker, was on that team. The entire linebacking core was absolutely disgusting. The Kobe Dean was there. The secondary was loaded. Out of everybody on that Georgia defense, Jalen Carter was still by far the best player. And that is no shade to Jordan Davis. I thought he was phenomenal coming out. Trayvon Walker, I mocked him at first overall. And yet everybody that really studied that Georgia defense, there was a consensus Jalen Carter was the best player. It wasn't even a discussion. So the fact that we're here now and, there's talk about Jalen slipping out of the top 10, he probably won't, because realistically speaking, he's one of the best defensive line prospects that we've had over the last decade of every DT prospect in the NFL. And by the way, with him still likely going in the top 10, despite the incident that happened, and I'm not going to try to rehash that too hard. I do want to have as nuanced of a take as I can about this. I personally don't know Jalen Carter. I have never talked to him. I've never interviewed him. I don't know exactly what happened that night, but I do think, just based on conversations I've had with people that are way more knowledgeable about this than I am, I do get the sense that the league does have legitimate concerns, not necessarily about football character. I don't think they're worried about effort level or putting in the time to train and learn the defense. I think they do have legitimate concerns, though, about off-field decision making. And I'm not going to say those are my concerns because, again, I don't know what happened, but I do think that we have to separate on-field grade, in which Jalen Carter is clearly the best player in this class, from off-field grade, in which I think there's reason to believe that teams have some concerns there. And I think that it is possible he slips a tiny little bit because of that. If there was no off-field concerns whatsoever, he's probably going in the top 3 to 4 picks. Like, he's not slipping past 4. But the fact that there is, something that I think some teams would be concerned about means that it's possible he slips down, as far as like the Bears at 9 overall or the Eagles at 10 overall. It doesn't mean that on the field he's the 9th or 10th best player in this class, because he's not. He's clearly number 1. But if there was ever anything that was going to push him down that far in the draft, it would probably be that and the concerns that teams have. So I'm trying to be as nuanced as I can about this, because I don't have all the information about exactly what happened, and I've never talked to the kid. So I'm not going to try to, kill his character when I've never met him. But I do know for sure that there are some teams that have some concerns, and I don't really have any information beyond that. So I'm just going to leave it there. All I know is that on tape, Jalen Carter is an absolute, he's a maniac. Like, he's a phenomenal football player. And no matter what, he's probably going in the top 10 picks. So get ready for that. It's going to happen. Not product placement, by the way. I just really like Pacifico. It's a really good beer. Anyway, tier 2. These guys, in my opinion, are not that far behind Jalen Carter, but I didn't feel comfortable grouping them with Jalen Carter. So they all make up tier 2. There's 3 names in this tier. All of them, in my opinion, could, or rather should, be first-round picks for different reasons. They're just not quite as complete a player as Jalen Carter. They all have different holes in their game. That being said, they're all phenomenal. They're all going to be day 1 starters and probably be really, really good day 1 starters. So without further ado, let's get to tier 2. I'm going to reiterate this several times because I know some people kind of skip around through time codes and everything like that. But when you see all these players grouped together in one tier, that means that all of them have roughly equivalent grades and they can be drafted in virtually any order. So just because you see Kalijah Kancey first, Keanu Benton second, and Mozzie Smith third, that's not a quote-unquote ranking or order that I have them in on a big board. That's just kind of where I have them grouped together as a tier. And it's really dealer's choice. It depends on the type of skill set you want, the type of role you need filled, maybe the type of body type you're looking for. They could get drafted in whatever order you want. It really doesn't matter to me. So I wanted to clarify that here. But looking at tier 2 as a whole, these are all really, really good players. Now, looking at Kalijah Kancey individually, just because he's the first name on that tier list, he's kind of your classic penetrating 3 technique on passing downs. He is an absolute ridiculous interior pass rusher. His lateral quickness and fluidity, there's just really nothing else like it in this class, other than obviously Jalen Carter. But in terms of who can get after the passer from the 3 technique spot, he is the best one in this class. That being said, he's pretty small, and I think that kind of shows up in the run game. I think he does get bullied in the run game a little bit. He cannot take on double teams. Really the only time I see him make plays against the run is like if he's backdooring a reach block on zone, or if he's beating an angle on counter, if he's chasing a puller and getting in the backfield, like all the kind of penetrating stuff as a run defender, he can do just fine. But in terms of taking on blocks, stacking, peeking, shedding, anchoring against double teams, that's not his game. That's not what he does. It doesn't mean that he can't take on blocks at all, but those big 320-pound guards, they just run over him. So I think in terms of early downs, I see him honestly more as like a 6 technique, like a base defensive end in a 4-3, that then kicks inside to rush the passer on third down. I liken that to kind of like a Michael Bennett role that you used to see in Seattle, where again, he played, base defensive end and then would rush the passer from the inside. Justin Tuck played that role once upon a time. He was a base defensive end that kicked inside. And if memory serves, Tuck was also about 280. So, even though he's 6'6", Kancey is like 5 inches shorter. But in terms of weight class, they're a very similar player with similar skill set. And I kind of think that's where Kancey is going to end up in the league. Like, let's say he went to the Eagles at 10 for whatever reason. I don't think they would play him at defensive tackle on early downs. I think they would play him at defensive end. And then when you get to 3rd and 8, that's when you kick him inside. And to be honest, a lot of other defenses in this league would probably do that too. It doesn't mean that Kancey can't go really, really high, because obviously rushing the passer is the most valuable skill set for a defensive lineman to have, in the modern NFL. Like, it just is. And he can do that better than almost anybody. So he's still going to go really, really high just for that. But if you think that you're getting a complete 3-technique defensive tackle, you're probably not. And in all likelihood, he's playing, again, kind of that split role where he's defensive end on early downs, defensive tackle on passing downs. Now, Keanu Benton, by contrast, looking at him individually, he's a very different player. I see him as somebody who could play anything from, a 3-technique and a 4-3 to, some of the teams that play like a quasi nose tackle role with a 2-eye or like a head up G technique. Those are the teams that kind of major in nickel. They treat their nose tackles basically just as 2 eyes now. I think he can do that. I also think that he could play some 5 technique for you if you're an odd front team. So he's somebody that pretty much anything from a 2-eye to a 5 technique, he's going to play that role and play it really, really well. I know that some people out there, especially with the teams themselves, internally have compared Keanu Benton to DJ Reader, which I get on some level, because Reader is like a top 3 nose tackle in the NFL who also happens to be a good pass rusher. But I don't necessarily see that exact comp, but I'm also not that far off, because I see him as just another Cam Hayward. So, whether it's DJ Reader or Cam Hayward, I don't think people are complaining either way. You're going to get a phenomenal player. I just happen to liken him more to Hayward because I see him more on like the 5-technique to 3-technique side of the spectrum than a nose tackle to a 3-technique side of the spectrum. It's not that far off. I just see a little bit different position for him in the NFL. And speaking of Cam Hayward, by the way, I really do think that the Steelers at around pick 17 are where we could potentially start seeing Keanu Benton go, really until anywhere like the mid to late 30s, maybe like the early 40s at the absolute latest, because again, there's a lot of really good defensive line prospects in this class, so some guys could fall a little bit just because of that. But mid first to mid second, that's going to be the sweet spot for Keanu Benton. And what you're getting with him is a true versatile interior defensive lineman that is super athletic. I know maybe the testing numbers don't fully back that, but on tape, he is really, really twitchy. He's got a wrestling background that really shows up when he's rushing the passer. Like, he's got violent hands. And, as a wrestler, you can kind of see where, the footwork and the hip torque that kind of plays into his style. Like, he just absolutely mauls people. He's got great leverage. Again, wrestling background really plays into it. Just when I watch him, again, I just see Cam Hayward. He really is a spitting image, and I think that he's going to go really, really high, a lot higher than people think. Is he quite as stout as Mazi Smith against the run? No. Is he quite as good as Kalijah Kancey as a pass rusher? No. But you're kind of hitting it right down the middle with him, which makes him a true 3-down player and ultimately might make him the most valuable player in this tier, just for the sole reason that he probably never has to come off the field. And you know what? Teams love it when they never have to take their first-round pick off the field. So Keanu Benton, phenomenal player. Expect to see him go somewhere starting around 17 to pick 40 to 42. That's the sweet spot there, and he's going to be really, really good wherever he goes. Now, rounding out tier 2, we're finishing with Mazi Smith, who, as I alluded to earlier, is the best run defender in this tier, and short of Jalen Carter himself, is probably the best run defender out of any defensive tackle in this class. And if I'm being honest, if there was anybody I was going to compare to DJ Reader, it wouldn't be Keanu Benton, it would be Mazi Smith. Now, he's not the pass rusher that DJ Reader is now, but neither was DJ Reader when he got into the league. So I think that he can possibly grow into that just like Reeder did. But, as a baseline going into his rookie year, he could be potentially as dominant a run defender as Reeder is in Cincinnati. And even going back to his Houston days, Reeder was phenomenal against the run there as well, and they have missed him ever since. So I think for teams that, desperately need interior run defense help, cough, cough, Buffalo, they arguably lost a playoff game because Daquan Jones got injured and they couldn't stop the run. So, if they took Mazi Smith in the first round just to give themselves some insurance against that problem, I wouldn't be surprised. But really any team that needs interior defensive line help because they can't stop the run, Mazi Smith is the guy you want in this class, of course, if you can't get Jalen Carter. In terms of alignment, I see him, again, kind of the opposite of Keanu Benton. He's more of a true either zero technique or shade nose that can also play a 2-eye or a G if we're in those nickel fronts where it's edge, 2-eye, 3 technique, edge, one of the more common fronts you see these days. I think that he would be that quasi nose tackle, whereas Benton's more of the 3 technique type. And what really is tough about playing against Mazi Smith is, looking at his frame and his build, he's just so low to the ground and so thick and so strong. It's like you're trying to block a tree stump and he just doesn't go anywhere. And the value that brings to a defense is if you have to stick on a combo block longer just to generate not just good movement, but any movement against a 2-eye technique, in a nickel front, if that center has to stick an extra step or two before he can move off that combo, that gives the linebackers an extra step or two of space, and all of a sudden the angles of the play they don't work anymore. You're not hitting your landmarks on time, the linebackers are getting over the top uncontested. Just Mazi Smith's presence alone can make an entire defense function way better. Again, just like DJ Reeder's presence alone makes the Bengals defense function way better. The linebackers are kept cleaner, the seams are closing quicker. If they're trying to run gap stuff right up the middle, there's no vertical displacement, so the back has to, try to pick a hole even quicker, and the pacing of the run is thrown off. There's just so many little details to run defense as a team that get made easier if you have a dominant nose tackle. And I'll be honest, a lot of NFL defenses these days don't have one. It's a really hard thing to find because the college ranks are not putting out that many of them these days. You're more likely to find somebody like Kalijah Kancey than you are, finding somebody like Mazi Smith. It's just a more rare skill set. But when you get up into the NFL, if you don't have that skill set on your team, you're probably going to lose. Case in point, Buffalo in the playoffs. Daquan Jones was out in the playoffs. They didn't have any other interior defensive linemen that were worth a shit against the run. They got blown off the ball. It was messy. It was horrible. And a really good team got bounced out of the playoffs because they didn't have a freaking nose tackle. So I think there's a lot of teams that want to avoid that fate, and Mazi Smith is going to be very attractive to those teams. He won't be the sexiest first or, maybe early second round pick, but he might end up being one of the best. And for me, that's what matters. Looking at the tier 3 defensive tackles in this class, it's probably the most diverse set of guys out of this entire position group because there's everything from, 6 techniques that I think are going to kick inside a 3 technique on passing downs. There's pure 5 techniques. There's 3 techniques. There's nose tackles. There's a little bit of everything in this tier, and all of them are really, really good players. Most of them are going to be drafted on day 2. Some of them might slip to the top at day 3, but it's a very, very well-rounded tackle class, and I think tier 3 is kind of the meat of it. If you miss out on the top end guys, you're still going to get a really quality player somewhere in day 2, early day 3 out of this tier 3 of players. Before we get to talking about all of them individually though, and breaking down their different strengths and weaknesses and scheme fits and what teams around the league might be interested in these guys, I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this week, Butcher Box, and conveniently, we're doing this episode in the kitchen, so I think it's probably the best fit possible. If you haven't heard of Butcher Box, which I'm sure you have at this point, but just in case you haven't, if you want any kind of cut of meat that you can think of delivered right to your door, they have it. And it's all grass-fed beef, it's wild-caught seafood, it's free-range chicken, it's pork that's raised crate-free. Really anything you can think of, They have it and they can send it right to you. You've seen a lot of the different food that I've cooked using different meats from ButcherBox on this channel before. I've done a strip loin with pancetta Brussels sprouts back when I was at the old house. I did a flat iron steak over there with like a homemade Lagavulin 16 jalapeno chimichurri, which sounds extra as fuck, and it definitely was, but it also came out really, really good. I used some of their ground beef to make some dirty rice, and I whipped up Cajun rubbed sirloin tips with potatoes on the side as well. However, now that I'm in the new kitchen at my new place, or at least attempting to move into my new kitchen, I wanted to save some of that meat to cook over here. And so what I saved was my chuck roast, I have a pork tenderloin, and most importantly of all, I have chicken thighs. And I used those chicken thighs last night in order to whip up a really good chicken fried rice with some leftover white rice that I had been, kind of purposefully sitting in the fridge for a couple days, specifically for chicken fried rice. That came out amazing. And if you want some extra free chicken thighs in every single ButcherBox box for an entire year, you can do so by using my promo code BOOTLEG at butcherbox.com/bootleg. You will also get $20 off your first order with ButcherBox when using that promo code. So again, whether you like beef or you like chicken or you like pork or seafood, whatever you like to cook, you can get it delivered right to your door from ButcherBox and get a year of every single shipment coming with 3 pounds of free chicken thighs on top of that, plus the $20 off too. So really good deal. Thank you once again to ButcherBox for sponsoring this week's show, or today's show. I can't remember how many I have coming out this week. But with all that said, thank you to ButcherBox, and let's get to Tier 3. As I said before, Tier 3 is a pretty varied group in terms of skill sets and roles and all that, and you can kind of draft these guys in whatever order you want to. I don't particularly think it matters. It just depends on scheme fit and role and all that stuff. But for me, in terms of my favorite Tier 3 defensive tackle to watch, that's going to be Kobe Turner out of Wake Forest. And he's got a really fascinating story. Spent a lot of time at Richmond, was relatively under-recruited because he was trying to decide if he wanted to do music or if he wanted to do football. Ended up double majoring in math and music. He writes his own orchestral pieces. It's actually why they call him the conductor at Wake. That's his nickname there, because he literally conducts orchestras. Extremely smart, high football IQ. Astronomical football IQ. One of the smartest defensive tackles I have ever personally interviewed. Oh, and by the way, he's a complete freak of nature in terms of athleticism. Keep in mind that at nearly 10 pounds heavier than Aaron Donald, he ran a faster 3-cone than Aaron Donald. He put up 7:09. Donald was 7:11, if I recall correctly. That's literally a 98th percentile 3-cone all time for any interior defensive lineman. He is extremely explosive off the ball. He's got a ton of power in his hands. He's very technically refined. He's played a bunch of different roles. He's played 2-eye, nose, 3 technique, 5 technique. You can kind of put him up and down the front, and he's going to be fine wherever. And just kind of taking the athleticism and the experience into account, plus the fact that he's really smart and he's a great locker room guy, I really do think he's a lock for top 100 at this point. He's the exact type of interior defensive lineman that every single coaching staff falls in love with. And I just think that versatility and talent and, exceptional character, he's just simply one of the safest defensive line prospects in this entire group. If you want to get to know him a little bit more, EJ and I did a really fantastic interview with him over on the podcast channel, the Bootleg Football Podcast. We had him breaking down his own tape, explaining his reads, explaining his technique, all that kind of stuff, getting to know him as a person a little bit. I think if you watch that interview, you're going to fall in love with him just like we did. And I think that interview in particular is going to be my best case for putting him this high in this DT class. Moving on from Turner, another one of my favorite interior linemen in this tier is going to be Byron Young from Alabama. He's a little bit different than Turner. I don't necessarily think he has quite the same athletic ceiling, but he still is a really good, solid athlete. He's kind of your classic Bama 5 technique. He's very well coached, great pop in his hands, fundamentally sound against the run, plays his assignments well. He's never really out of position. He's got more juice as a pass rusher than most Bama 5 techniques, but again, I don't necessarily see him as overly explosive, especially compared to some of the other guys in this class. he can actually get an edge on you and win if he's kind of playing like that looser 5 technique. And I think that he has the quickness to be effective as a looper on stunts and games and things like that. So overall, in terms of role, 5 technique early on that can play some 3 technique as well for, 4-3 teams. Really just somebody that can kind of flex between those 2 spots, because so many different defenses, there's really no true 3-4 and 4-3 anymore. They all kind of play the same fronts, just with different pieces. They all, have little minor differences, but in terms of those 2 alignments, 5 technique, like a looser 5 technique, I should say, and 3 technique, that's probably where he's going to live. So again, very solid player, like Byron Young a lot. He's also probably going to go somewhere in the 3rd round and be a really, really good rotational piece for probably a long time. Like, I think he's going to have a pretty decent career. Going from there to Gervin Dexter, who I also think is another 5 technique / maybe 3 technique on passing downs. He's a little bit different than Byron Young. I think Byron Young is further along in his development, but I think that Gervin Dexter has a higher ceiling if he can get there. He is one of the most stout run defenders in this class in terms of just having dynamite in his hands. He has an incredible amount of pop in his punch as a run defender. Extremely well coached. There's some teach tape that he had against Georgia where he's kind of demonstrating lock, peek, shed technique against the run. And I swear to God, you could put that up in a film room in any NFL locker room and use that as teach tape. He is really, really good in terms of like that initial bench press, peeking, and then shedding against the run. Very few guys are better than him at that in this class. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that those reps kind of remind me of Eric Armstead a little bit, which is really high praise because Armstead is a phenomenal player. So in terms of his top-end ceiling comp, it's probably Eric Armstead. But the reason why I have him in tier 3 and not higher, considering that high praise, is that he is kind of consistently slow off the ball. Even though on paper he is a good athlete, it's just for whatever reason, his first step doesn't trigger as quickly as it probably should. And I can't quite tell if it's because, maybe his block recognition is a little bit slower, or maybe his coaches said, don't read the ball, read the block. There's just a whole bunch of different, very minor technical reasons and coaching reasons why a young player could be slow off the ball. So I'm not going to presume to say that he's just got a bad first step, because athletically, like, you see the athletes there. There's just something more to that I haven't quite figured out. It's a very similar thing to Randy Gregory when he was coming out of Nebraska. Everybody said he was slow off the ball, but it's just based on the reads that he was being taught as a defensive lineman at Nebraska. Then he got to the NFL and he was totally fine. So I'm not going to presume that he's going to be slow off the ball in the NFL. It just kind of depends on what his coaches are teaching him. Now, to expand on that a little bit, as a pass rusher, I think he's a lot more raw than as a run defender. He doesn't really have any instinct as a pass rusher right now, doesn't really rush with a plan. He's just all power with a little bit of quickness and just overwhelming people with his athleticism. And I think you can get by in college with that, but you get to the NFL where everybody else is also a really good athlete and they got better technique than you. He's probably not going to be a good pass rusher immediately in the NFL. He'll be a good run defender, but as a pass rusher, he's probably a couple years away. So, kind of combining all these things into one grade, that's why I have him down in tier 3. He has phenomenal tools, but he's just a really inconsistent player, and I think he's got to go to the right coaching staff that can get the most out of him as possible. Now, moving on from Gervin Dexter, next up here we got Jared Clark from Coastal Carolina, who is, again, a different role than the other guys we talked about previously in this tier. I see him more as like a nose shade or a 2-eye. I'd maybe even put him as like a head-up G if we're, playing like the double head-up 2s, which some defenses like to do these days. It's more of a lower level, like high school, college thing, but you see it in the NFL sometimes too. Either way, anything from like a true zero nose out to a head-up G, I could see Jared Clark doing. He's got overwhelming power, but is still kind of underratedly quick at his size. Like, he's a really big frame dude, 330 plus pounds. So kind of taking that power plus, underrated quickness profile into account, he kind of reminds me of Grover Stewart. like from a physical standpoint, it's very similar to Grover Stewart. He's not just a space eater, but somebody who can run sideline to sideline and keep pace to close off those seams against outside zone, which not every bigger nose tackle can do. You know, some guys, they gas out halfway through the game and all of a sudden they're slow to those landmarks. They're slow to keep up with those reach blocks, and the seams just get wider and wider as the game goes on. Not so for Clark. Very good athlete. He's not going to fall behind. And then when it comes to gap scheme runs that are running like right downhill, right at him, again, he is so overwhelmingly powerful that he just completely discards smaller linemen in gap schemes. Like, you're not going to be able to wash him down unless you are also bringing a guard that has 320 plus pounds of beef. It's just not going to happen. So I think that, you know, he does have that Grover Stewart type potential. He also has some pass rush versatility, just like Grover Stewart does at times. In terms of why I have him at tier 3 and not tier 2, again, I kind of want to reserve tier 2 for the guys that I know are going to start day one and be really effective players. Clark, for me, is not that far off of Mazi Smith, but I just couldn't quite sneak him into tier 2. So if you miss out on Mazi Smith and you're still looking for a nose, I think that Clark is probably the best one you're going to get in this class. And even if he's not starting day one, I do think he will start pretty quickly and be a very, very effective player. So he's one of my favorite noses in this class. And then rounding off tier 3, we have two guys who I think, even though, you know, physically they're not quite the same, I think in terms of role, and that's going to be both Adetomiwa Adebawore from Northwestern and Brian Bresee from Clemson. I see both of these guys as like a quasi Morgan Fox-ish type of player, with like a little sprinkle of Michael Bennett, if that makes sense. I know that's a really weird comp, but just let me explain. I think that both of them would be playing either a 6 technique end or a 5 technique on early downs, just like Kalijah Kancey. You know, Adebawore might be a little bit better at it than Bresee. And then on passing downs, I would kick them inside to 3 technique to rush, because I don't necessarily think that they would be able to rush from the edge. Kancey might be able to do it. I don't think that these guys would be able to do it. So again, they're kind of like that flex defensive end in an even front that plays like, you know, the base end spot, the strong side end spot on early downs. You kick him inside on passing downs. And the Morgan Fox comp comes in because I think that, you know, if you're playing like a 5-man surface, you'd put him or both of them really at like the backside 4-eye spot, like how Morgan Fox has been used. And even though neither of them are going to be able to hold up against double teams at all, like they get crushed against double teams, just like Morgan Fox does. I would put them at 4-eye because against zone run games, in particular from a 5-man surface, they have such great quickness and penetration ability that they're going to be able to, you know, really close down that B gap with quickness, just like Morgan Fox does. And like zone run games would just be completely worthless against them. And I mean that in a good way. And I know I'm being like hyper specific with the comps and the role here, but that's just what I see, right? You know, 6 technique that can handle a tight end, 1-on-1 as a base end, you know, 5-man surface, you play him at 4-eye on the backside, and, you know, you can completely shut down zone run games. And then if you're in like 3rd and 7, you put him at 3 technique and say, go rush. If you try to play both of them at 3 technique full time, you're really gonna hurt because they will get blown off the ball by double teams. They will get washed down on power. They will get absolutely crushed on counter. Like, they're not built to hold up against gap scheme stuff that runs right at them. Zone scheme, they'll be fine. They win on quickness, all that stuff. But gap scheme, they would get fucking obliterated. I'm not kidding. It's a bad idea. Don't do it. I'm only playing them inside of the 4-eye on passing downs when they're not going to get run against. One extra couple of notes on Adebawore, by the way, because I know he's getting a lot of hype because of his athletic testing, and I fully acknowledge there are some reps on tape that look like Aaron Donald. Like, he is an Aaron Donald level athlete, but nowhere near Aaron Donald's power, which is why I think that comp doesn't hold water to me. Like, athletic testing versus what you see on tape are two very different things. I think if he's taking on like a base block 1-on-1, yeah, he's going to be fine. He'll hold that front side shoulder. He'll do his job. He'll force the cutback, all that shit. But, AD can actually take on doubles at 280. Adebawore can't do that. The only reps that I really think he looks somewhat similar to AD are, if he's doing like a cross chop move, or, if he's lined up as like a looser 3 and he's rushing on a guard and he's just so explosive, like that stuff, I get the comparison. Everything else, no way. He's not AD. Oh, and by the way, he also misses a lot of tackles. He's in like the bottom 15th percentile among all defensive linemen out of, over 400 schools that are playing college football. He's in the bottom 15th percentile in terms of missed tackles. So even though he will penetrate, he does have struggles finishing the play and actually making the tackle, which is really frustrating. So I think just taking that whole profile into account of, good athlete, but not super versatile in terms of where we can line him up on early downs versus passing downs, misses tackles, all that stuff. I think that he's going to end up somewhere late day 2, early day 3. I know his athletic testing suggests otherwise, but I just don't get the sense that teams are as big on him as the media is right now, because they've watched all this tape and they've seen the problems that have shown up. And quite frankly, not every team needs that type of role filled. A lot of them already have players that can do that. So, maybe he falls a little bit. We'll see. I'm not saying that, like, absolutely he's going to fall, but I understand the reasons why if he does. And Bresee, the same thing. Bresee's getting some first round hype. I don't see that at all. Like, I get it. There are some really pretty pass rush reps on tape. There's some really gorgeous tackles for loss that he gets as a penetrator. But you put on the tape of him trying to take on a base block sometimes and him getting dug out. He's just not good against the run. It's a plain fact. He is not good against the run. And so, again, limited role. Can be that Morgan Fox type. And Foxy, I love Foxy. He's a great player. And even Foxy, I think, is better against the run than Bresee, but only in certain looks and only against certain types of runs. It's just not a type of role and not a type of player that every single defense is going to use. So I do think there's a limited number of teams that would be interested in him. It doesn't mean that he's not a good player. It doesn't mean that he won't have a successful career. I just personally don't align with the amount of hype that Bresee has gotten. I think that he has a limited skill set. I think that he will have a fine career as a rotational guy. I just don't see a full-time player on tape. Hopefully all of that made sense, because my grades for Adebawore and Bresee are very similar. And hopefully my notes for the other guys made sense too. Again, if you have any questions about any of these tier 3 tackles, because I know it's a very versatile group with some wildly different projections, please sound off in the comments below. I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. There's not a whole lot of difference between tier 4 and tier 3 in these rankings. I just didn't want tier 3 to be like 15 names long. You could argue some of these tier 4 guys being in tier 3. And to be honest, some of them are going to end up getting drafted before the tier 3 guys. Again, it just depends on system fit and archetype and role and all that stuff. But there's some really, really talented players in tier 4 here that could go way earlier than even I'm projecting them. And I just had to cut it off somewhere and find some sort of delineation between tier 3 and tier 4. But all these guys are really good, and they're all going to be drafted somewhere between late day 2 to like mid day 3, somewhere around there. So with that, let's get to the still very, very talented tier 4. First up here, we got Moro Ajomo from Texas, who, if you watch the Lions episode that I put out recently, you're already familiar with him. But if you haven't watched that episode, I'll kind of recap my thoughts on him here. He is one of the most devastatingly powerful run defenders in this class. I think that him and Gervin Dexter are both, two peas in a pod when it comes to that part of their game. You can put him at 5 technique and he's going to dominate tackles against the run. You can put him at 3 technique. He's going to dominate most guards against the run. Just his combination of length and power and, first step explosiveness when he really gets into people's chest. He plays with good pad level, and he's just really overwhelmingly powerful against the run. One of the very best early down defenders in all of college football at any position, any level. He is one of the best. However, just like Gervin Dexter, I do see him as a little bit more raw as a pass rusher, and he's not quite the same athlete as Dexter, in my opinion. I think he's a very linear athlete, again, going straight forward, first step, explosiveness, pop, power, all that stuff. He's got that just like Dexter, but I think Dexter has a little bit more lateral wiggle than him. Not much, but a little bit, which is why, again, I have one in tier 3 and one in tier 4. But that being said, Moro Ojomo could develop into being a really effective pocket crusher with maybe a couple extra counter moves that, he throws based on that power as his fastball. I think that he could get there eventually. As a rookie, he will get plenty of snaps because of his effectiveness as a run defender. He's going to be playing quite a bit because of that, but I don't necessarily predict a bunch of third down snaps for him unless somehow, he ends up being like a really good player on stunts and games and using that power to set up loopers, which, again, totally possible. But in terms of, playing 3 technique on 3rd and 7 where you got a two-way go on a guard and you better go win, I don't think he's going to do that yet. He's probably a couple years away from that, just like Dexter is. So I think if you're looking for a really good run-stopping interior defensive lineman, regardless of the scheme you play, honestly, if you're looking for a 5 technique and you're an odd front team, he could do that. If you're an even front team and you're looking for a 3 technique, he can do that. Although, again, like I said, pretty much every team at some point is going to play every front. There's really no rigid 3-4 or 4-3 teams anymore, but anyway, in terms of what you major in, odd versus even front, he's going to fit you no matter what. Very, very solid player. Watched him at Shrine Bowl, had a great week there, and has just kind of steadily ascended the ranks ever since then. So he's going to go, my best guess, somewhere in the 4th round. Maybe could climb up to late 3rd, but I think his sweet spot is somewhere in the 4th round, and he's going to be a very, very effective player for whoever takes him. Next up here in this tier, we have Nesta Jade Silvera from Arizona State. And I got to him a little bit later in the process. He was a Senior Bowl guy, and obviously I didn't go to the Senior Bowl this year. I was only at Shrine Bowl because they're the same freaking week, and it's really hard to go to both, and I typically can only choose one, and Shrine Bowl is closer to me. But Silvera I got to later because he's a Senior Bowl guy, and I usually get to them after I get to the Shrine Bowl group. And I came away really, really impressed with him. He's built like a cannonball and plays like 1-2. He's just this little boulder of destruction, lower to the ground, kind of like a Timmy Jernigan type build, 6'1", 315, 317, somewhere in that general vicinity. Plays with his hair on fire every single play. And he's one of the best juice guys in that locker room too. Team leader, endless energy, endless motor, plays like a freaking maniac, and I love him for it. He's much more stout against the run than most other, typical 3 techniques that are all about penetration and quickness. Silvera can really, kind of anchor down and hang in there, even against double teams, which it's hard to find a 3 technique these days that can actually anchor against double teams because so many defenses have gone with like the lighter 295 pound 3 techniques. Silvera is a little bit more of a throwback where if you're trying to run power or counter at him, it's going to be tough to displace him, and it's going to really, mess up your angles in terms of blocking schemes. So I think he's very valuable from that standpoint. I don't think he's the greatest athlete in terms of when he's given 2-way goes to go work as a pass rusher, but he's still fine. He's very solid, kind of a middle of the fairway pick for a rotational 3 technique with some nose versatility as well, because again, he holds up against double teams a lot better than you would expect. So if you're playing one of these fronts, especially like for teams that major in nickel, where you've got either a shade nose or a 2-eye and then a 3 technique, and then when you get motion, you shift the defensive tackles. Again, we call that a flex front. If you're familiar with like Kirby Smart terminology, that's why Georgia plays 2 guys that can play either role, because in those flex fronts, they're going to move the nose to a 3 and the 3 to a nose based on motion. So you need to have both guys that can play both roles, or else you're going to get picked apart by teams that use a lot of motion. So I think Silvera can do that. You want him to play 3, he can do that. You want him to play nose, he can do that. You're not going to worry about getting caught out against motion and then getting completely run over. So I think for teams, especially teams that play a lot of nickel, even against quote unquote, heavier personnel for offenses, like Buffalo. Like Buffalo plays nickel almost no matter what. Silvera is a great candidate for them because of that versatility in alignment. And you're going to get him just like Moro Ojomo, probably in the 4th round. And getting that type of player that late in the draft, I think, is a pretty good value. So he's one of the more underrated interior defensive linemen in this class because of that versatility, because of that stoutness, because of that pass rush ability. He's just a very solid all-around player. Now, moving on from Silvera, next up we got Jacqueline Roy from LSU, who has gotten quite a bit of hype recently. You know, people are posting about him as like a day 2 defensive tackle. Personally, for me, I don't see that. I do think he's a solid player. That's why I have him in tier 4, but I don't really see him on the same level as, say, like Kobe Turner or Byron Young or Jared Clark, any of those guys. I don't quite see him at that level. He's more of a straight line 3 technique that does not have pretty much any bend or wiggle at all. Like, he's got some nice splash plays where he doesn't have to change direction, and he can either just bull rush or like ricochet and penetrate against zone. He's got a nice little club move as a pass rusher with his right arm in particular. Like, he's really strong with it. He'll club a guard and then sidestep and get around him. But again, these are all moves that don't require any bend at all because he doesn't have any bend. It's very much straight line power and explosiveness. And he did play nose quite a bit at LSU, probably because of that straight line power. But what I found odd was, especially because of pad level, he doesn't really hold up against double teams against NFL caliber centers. Like Ricky Stromberg from Arkansas absolutely beat the shit out of him. And to be fair, Ricky Stromberg beat the shit out of everybody. He's a really good player, and he's probably going to be drafted a lot higher than people think. But man, Arkansas just abused him. I do not think he's going to hold up against doubles in the NFL, so he's not a nose to me. I think he's a rotational 3 technique or maybe a 5 technique with maybe some starter potential down the line, but with that lack of bend and inconsistent pad level, and again, just inconsistency against the run where, you know, if it's a one-on-one base block, he'll be fine, but against doubles, he gets washed. I don't know, man. I think that that's a rotational player who, again, could stick in the league for a while and be that backup rotational piece, but I don't necessarily see the upside there that I do with Kobe Turner athletically. I don't think they're the same caliber of player. I don't want this to sound like overly negative because, again, I have him in tier 4. I do think he's solid. I want to push back a little bit against that hype. From Roy, there are 2 more nose tackles in this tier that I really do like quite a bit, but I think that they're not as versatile as, say, Jared Clark from Coastal Carolina. I don't think that either one of these guys has the same level of pass rush ability as Clark, and that's going to be Keandre Coburn from Texas and Siaki Ika from Baylor. I think they play roughly the same role. You know, again, 0 technique nose, shade, 2-eye, you know, maybe put him as a head-up G at the absolute widest. And they're both going to be really stout against the run. They're very tough to uproot because they're low to the ground. You know, these guys are not super tall, so they have great pad level naturally. And they're both 330 plus pounds. You know, going into Shrine Bowl, Coburn actually lost, I think it was 13 pounds, if I recall correctly. He lost that much weight just to get down to the low 330s. So these are big boys. You know, they're tough to uproot against the run. I think they have a role just from that alone, because those double teams are going to have to stick a little bit longer just to try to displace them, if they can't even displace them at all. And that's going to free up your linebackers with just an extra couple steps of space. So in terms of early down players, yes, they absolutely will be on the field, but I don't think that either of them will ever get third down work. I think there are nose tackles in the league that can rush the passer. These 2 are probably not that. If I had to choose between one of them, I'd probably choose Coburn because he's got a little bit more wiggle as a pass rusher than Ika. And I know that surprises people because Ika's been seen as like a top 50 type guy. And who knows, you know, maybe somebody's going to fall in love and go get Ika early on. But for me, I think that there's not really that big of a difference between Coburn and Ika. They're both going to be early day 3 guys in my estimation because of their very limited roles. They are good in those roles. Again, I don't want to, you know, make it sound like they're not worthy of being picked. They are good in those roles. They can stop the run. That is a very valuable thing to have. But I think early down nose tackles that can stop the run and pretty much only stop the run is not something that typically goes in the first 3 rounds. I just don't quite see that. Vita Vea went in the first round, but that's because Vita Vea was A monster against the run, and B, could also rush the passer. So it's kind of a rare thing to find, and I don't see it with these two guys. They're going to play for a long time. Again, being positive here, they're tier 4 for a reason. They're going to play for a long time because of that ability, but I just see them as rotational pieces and not foundational pieces, if that makes sense. Once again, if you have any questions about any of my notes, both positive or negative for anybody in this tier, please leave a comment below. I'd be happy to answer those questions. Okay, we are finally here. It's time to talk tier 5. And I don't want to make it sound like because these guys are in tier 5 that they're not good players. I don't have any guys that I don't have draftable grades in these rankings. I'm not, ranking guys that are going to be likely UDFA. All these guys are going to be drafted, so I still think highly of these tier 5 players. I just don't quite have the same grade on them as I do on tiers 1 through 4 for pretty obvious reasons that we'll get into when we talk about their film. That being said, all these guys could go as high as the 4th round, all the way through the 6th round, to be perfectly honest, depending on where teams have them and the roles they project. It doesn't mean that they're bad players. It just means that I have more questions about them than I do about the guys above them. So they're still good. They're still going to get drafted. They're still quality players. I just wanted to make that clear that tier 5 doesn't mean bad. It just means not as good as the others. So with that, let's get into tier 5. We're going to start off this tier with perhaps the biggest question mark out of anybody in this entire interior defensive line class, and that's Jalen Redmond. I put him in tier 5 because, quite frankly, I didn't know what to do with him, and I think there's a lot of teams that also don't really know what to do with him. He has a wild draft profile. He came out of high school as a 5-star, 235-pound weak side edge, and then he left college as a 295-pound nose tackle. So he put on 60 pounds throughout his time in Oklahoma, which is not something that you see often. He sat out his first year in 2018 because of a blood clot issue, and then played as a redshirt freshman in 2019. And then he sat out in 2020 in the COVID year because of that clot issue. The doctors were a little bit concerned, so they said sit out 2020. So then he played part of 2021 the year after that, but he didn't make it through the entire year because he got hurt in that year. So he only got like 8 games in 2021. And then he was finally healthy-ish in 2022, even though he started off the year coming off a concussion that kind of limited him in the summer. But he finally got out there in 2022 and really did make a big impact. But you can see how raw he still is as an interior defensive lineman. Again, he has not carried this type of weight his entire life. This is a new thing for him. They recently converted him to interior defensive line. They recently put on that much weight, so he's still trying to figure it out in terms of how to move with it. And I do think that on tape, he does flash a lot of explosiveness and athleticism. Like, you can see why he was considered a 5-star edge prospect at some point that they then later converted. Like, in terms of testing numbers, he blew everybody out of the water amongst this entire interior line class because of that natural athleticism. However, because he is new to playing inside, I think that he still kind of has a long way to go from a technical perspective. People don't realize this, but playing out on the edge and playing inside, it's very, very different in terms of how quickly space closes on you, in terms of, using your length to measure against an offensive lineman so you can time your own moves and neutralize hands. Things just happen a lot quicker the closer you get to the ball. Nose tackles and 3 techniques have to react a lot quicker than, say, an edge rusher that's going to get like a second of runway before they engage with the tackle. It's just a very, very different skill set that sometimes takes a little while to learn, a little while to develop that timing and how you want to use your hands inside. And to me, just watching him on tape, like, you could tell he didn't quite know what he was doing yet. It doesn't mean that he can't get there eventually. It just might take him a little while. He's still new to this position. He's still new to this weight class. I'm going to give him a break there. But I know that teams are also thinking the same thing. And I think that, based on medical evaluations, which I have no access to whatsoever, there is a pretty significant medical history there too, which might play a factor in him sliding a little bit. So I think in terms of overall ceiling, he has one of the highest ceiling, especially as a pass rusher, out of any interior lineman in this class, probably not named Jalen Carter or Kalijah Kancey. Like, he has one of the highest pass rush ceilings out of all of them. But boy, his floor is super low. So I have him in tier 5 because of that, because he is not ready at all right now. I think that if he gets snaps as a rookie, it will solely be as like a rotational piece. Maybe we're getting like 15 to 20 snaps a game, trying to bring him along, try to coach him up. But I don't see a significant role for him probably until like 2024, 2025. It's going to take a while to get there, but if it pays off, if you can coach him up, he is so athletic and so explosive that you're probably going to end up with a pretty good player. He is likely going to fall because of all the reasons I stated, but he's not going to fall that far also because of the reasons that I stated. So keep an eye on Jalen Redmond. Very exciting prospect, but very raw prospect, at least as of right now. Next up after Redmond, we got Broderick Martin from Western Kentucky. And he's somebody who I struggled with in my evaluation because there are some really, really high highs and some very, very low lows. Like, even just within the same game. Like, you throw in the Auburn game, and it's a freaking roller coaster. I never really knew what I was going to get from snap to snap. All I know is that he has not yet found a way to maximize his size as a nose tackle, even though he primarily played there. Like, you look at his dimensions, 6'5", 330 plus pounds, and you're like, okay, he should absolutely be dunking on people. And to be fair, that happens sometimes. Like, you throw in the Auburn game, he was thrown around the center like a rag doll in some plays, and then on other plays, he was getting obliterated against the run. So I just don't think that he fully maximizes his size on every single play. I think he's highly inconsistent, but you see the flashes and you know that he can do it. You just have to trust your defensive line coach to get that out of him all the time. In terms of role that I would think he would be playing as a rookie, if he even got snaps as a rookie, which I know is not a guaranteed thing for a day 3 interior defensive lineman, but let's say he's getting snaps. I think that his ideal role early on is as a 5 technique for some odd front team that majors in odd fronts. I think that he would do well in that type of system where he's just taking on a tackle and not dealing with too many doubles from that alignment and from that angle of attack, because I think that he can control those one-on-ones just fine while we teach him how to more consistently handle doubles, and then eventually we just kind of kick him further and further inside until he's playing like a shade nose or a 2-eye and not getting absolutely crushed. It's a very similar development plan that the Steelers use with Stephon Tuitt, where it's like, all right, we're going to play you outside and then slowly move you further and further inside when we think you're ready. And then, by 3 or 4 years in, Tuitt was playing every spot alongside Hayward and doing all of them at an elite level. So, maybe Broderick Martin could get there eventually. I'm not personally predicting that he will, but I could see him potentially, maybe, possibly having that type of development arc. But as of right now, yeah, he's a rotational 5 technique. Next up in this tier, we have Zach Pickens, who is one of the most one-dimensional players in this entire class. He is a straight-up penetrating 3 technique that cannot anchor against the run to save his fucking life. Oh my God, he is so bad against the run. Like, I am not putting him on the field on early downs ever, at all. Can't do it. Won't do it. Absolutely not. Zach Pickens is a pass rushing 3 technique only, folks. That's why he's in tier 5. He's good at that. Like, he's a good penetrator. I'm going to give him credit. Good athlete, all that stuff, gets upfield. But holy shit, if you put him on the field on 1st and 10 to start a drive, they're going to run him over. And then they're going to do it again and again and again. Like, just throw on the Arkansas game and watch Ricky Stromberg take this dude's lunch money. It was ugly, okay? So, Zach Pickens, good player. Again, have a draftable grade on him. Penetrating 3 technique, pass rusher, all that stuff. He's quick. He's athletic. He's got really nice counter moves as a pass rusher. He does that part really well. but I am only putting him on the field on third down, and that's it. At least for now. Like, again, maybe you can teach him to stop the run eventually, but as of right now, no fucking way. Like, absolutely not am I putting him on the field on early downs. And then Cameron Young from Mississippi State is kind of the exact opposite. Really good run stopping, both 5 technique and 3 technique, with pretty much no juice as a pass rusher at all. He is stout and well coached on early downs, very similar like Gervin Dexter's profile, but just not as athletic at all. He's probably going to carve out a role in the league just for that ability to stop the run on early downs, and then you swap him out for an actual pass rusher, like, say, Zach Pickens on third downs. But he's not a 3-down player, just like Pickens is not a 3-down player. So, again, we're kind of getting into that area of the draft right now where we're getting guys who can do one thing really well, and then we hope we can fill in the gaps later. But Cameron Young as a run stopper, good. Pass rusher, bad. Pickens as a pass rusher, good. As a run stopper, fucking horrific. So they're probably going to go on day 3 because of that. Again, they will be drafted, but maybe not as high as people think. At least in my opinion, not as high as people think. Okay, hopefully this was enlightening or at least entertaining, going through this DT class from start to finish. I'm sure there's some names that I didn't talk about that you're very interested in, and obviously you can drop comments down below and ask me about them. Or, later this month, drop by our live stream over on our podcast channel, the Bootleg Football Podcast. We're going to be live streaming during every single pick of the draft. It's like a 19-hour total in terms of hours across 3 days. We're going to be live breaking down every single pick as it happens. We've had a whole bunch of pre-draft content going live. We've got post-draft content. We also obviously have prospect interviews at pretty much every single position that have been going up over there. So as much draft content as we've had over here, there's even more over on Bootleg Football. So go check that out. Plan on being there for our live stream during every single pick of the draft. Also, we're going to be in Kansas City for the draft too. So if you live in that area, you want to grab a beer, we're going to try to find time for that as well too. So, and with that, I'm going to get started on the Edge Rusher episode. Little note to my editors, Autumn, Anthony, Jay, I apologize in advance for the sheer number of edge rushers we're about to talk about. It's the deepest class that I can remember ever. Pretty much. I think I went through like 45 names and ended up with in the mid-30s for draftable grades. So the Edge Rusher episode is going to be an absolute fucking monster. I have no idea when that's going to come out, but we're working as hard as we possibly can on it. My editors are absolute beasts, and we'll get that out as soon as we possibly can. So until then, later.